I thought we'd just chat, it's generally about your background and how that led to sport and then commentating and then human rights. And then we'll just kind of see where that goes. Okay. I know, for instance, that you grew up in Lismore, New South Wales. I haven't been there, but I have friends who live there, and I understand that there's quite a thriving arts community there now. But I'm guessing that when you were growing up, it might have been a different place. Can you tell us a little bit more about whether, in terms of multicultural input, was it very different?
Yes, it was very different to what it is today, and it was hugely monocultural. And today, like everywhere else in Australia, the face of the North Coast region is very, very different. But growing up, it was very largely Anglo-Celtic, and we had a Italian fruit shop in town, and we had all of these people of whom I went to school with and are lifelong friends of mine, and I think we might have had one or two Greek families in town, and what happened was, around 15 years of age, I took off to go play for the junior national team, and subsequently ended up at the AIS in Canberra, and that was a national program. And all of a sudden, I lobbed into this environment where there were kids of all backgrounds from all states around the country, and walked out of that into the National Soccer League, NSL as it was known at the time, which was largely ethnically based clubs. And my first club was Sydney, Croatia. I went on to play for Serb, Italian clubs, and even Maltese. Sunshine George Cross in Melbourne. So the game opened up for me this whole vista of diversity, which subsequently, of course, then led on to SBS and became then about inclusion, which is naturally the much bigger challenge.
So just tell us a bit about what kind of impact that would have had, being exposed to all these different cultures, especially given your background, where you I guess would not have had. I'm assuming it'll be good and bad influences. Was that the case?
Well, it was very different. So stepping into the AIS there, the kids that were coming out of Melbourne came from very different backgrounds, different cultures. We had Italian kids, Croatian kids, and the whole gamut. And it was, it just opened my eyes. I thought it was fabulous. And then through that environment, we actually lived together. But this is what sport does, right? So it wasn't as I was a 15-year-old kid, so I wasn't sitting there saying, oh, well, here's this Italian young person, that I'm sitting across from, talking through different life experiences. That's the beauty of sport. We actually live together in residences there, and it becomes natural. We play together, we train together every day, and so you immediately you don't see barriers. You see past that because we're just teammates. And I think that's the lesson that sport provides for children, and it's the power that sport has here and around the world that I've lived and experienced is I guess why at this age, I'm 50 this year, I am increasingly trying to use my platform, if you like, to espouse that message and to support social programs and to encourage, if not threaten, sport to undertake their social obligations for a whole variety of reasons. But I believe as a social institution, sport is critically important, not just to creating the country that we need to see, but also it has a responsibility that it has largely not been willing to live up to.
It is, of course, just a wonderful feel-good factor as well. I mean, just a way of uniting people of different backgrounds. Give us a sense of, in those early days when you were in your playing career, where did football fit into the Australian landscape in terms of support it got, in terms of the populism of the game?
Yeah, so coming out of our game is really interesting. I think it all kind of, in my life, it's all knitted together very well because football is the multicultural game, clearly, in a country that has had challenges over a very long period of time with immigration, with the sense of other, with new arrivals, with different languages, with different colours, with different cultures, and our game has experienced that. So, if I kind of try and step back sometimes, I think, my whole life experience has been about, in many ways, playing in a game that was considered the other. Like the football in this country, soccer was considered the immigrant game, or it used to be called wog ball to many people, as my former colleague Johnny Warren so famously said and wrote. So the game was treated in a way that was symbolic of how many of our communities were treated, and therefore I've seen it, I've experienced it, I've watched it, both from within football and from sitting on SBS. And from travelling the world in the game and playing on every continent, but also living in Asia. I lived in Singapore and Hong Kong and playing when I was young, and then I ended up living in London, playing in England. And all of those experiences, give me the perspective, I think, of understanding how many of our communities are thought of, how they're treated, how they're seen, and that's kind of led me into this field that's front and centre for me at the moment, is around asylum seekers. But the game, what's interesting about our game was it was seen as it was the game that provided a platform for new communities in Australia post Second World War to integrate, to find belonging, to integrate with other communities, to find common ground on the competitive field between many ethnic backgrounds who had come out of war zone situations and abroad had conflict between the different ethnicities, and in Australia were having to now come together and play on the field, and there was some conflict around that. And Australia, much of Australia, certainly the popular media anyway, saw that as an indictment on this sport that was bringing these things out, rather than the fact that the sport was allowing the collusion to occur, and that what was naturally coming out of that was issues that society had to face, rather than an issue of a sport. I mean, as ridiculous as it is to say, that's what basically the media were saying in Australia, was this is a riot sport. This sport is a wog sport where we have all these problems. And of course now we see increasingly some issues even in southern states with AFL, where they're having some issues around crowds and some violence at games and so on. I think that's probably surprising a few people, because they're looking and saying, well, this is what we were so critical of years ago, and now that's occurring in our own backyard. Of course, whether they can conflate the two is a very different question. But that was very much the experience of football, and people wanted to exclude it rather than deal with what those common problems were. They were worked out very largely over time through the next generation and through the game. So in actual fact, the contribution of the global game to a social cohesion, to the extent that it exists in Australia, has been extraordinary, because it's through their social football clubs that so many of these communities found a place in Australia. It's a remarkable story of the contribution of the game, but because of the way the game has, I think, firstly both been treated, and secondly has kind of responded to that, it hasn't been able to tell that story. One day it'll be told.
So, we sort of infamously went from the 1970s, when Johnny Warren was playing, 74, to 2006 not qualifying for the World Cup finals. That was a huge change, I think, for Australia as a nation. Just to allow that kind of, the things you spoke about, the factors that allowed that inclusion to take place, what do you think allowed that to move forward? I mean, was it something within the football community? Was it outside of that allowed that movement to take place, so that football could become an insider sport rather than something that the other plays?
So the sport's always been huge. So and the numbers of children and youth and people playing football in this country is immense and always has been. But the perception of the game at the top level, where the popular media has a responsibility to report on the game, has been largely focused on these issues that we had between communities. Then what's interesting is that early in this century, football made the decision, well, firstly to change the name. So what it wanted to do was, or it decided, was to reject the past and become homogenous and what was seen as popular to all Australians. And people made the decision that the way to make that happen was to reject the ethnicity of the game. And so it's an interesting case study for multiculturalism in Australia, because many years later, almost 2 decades later, the game is now doing the opposite, is going back and wanting to recognise, and it says celebrate the history which only a few years ago it didn't want to know. So rather than deal with some of the challenges that the game faced and speak to Australia about the importance of the diversity of the game, it actually wanted to do the opposite. Today, so for instance, there was a policy whereby clubs all around the country couldn't have the flag of their ethnicity on their badge or anywhere really around their club in their paraphernalia. That's only recently been lifted. And it's going to be interesting to see, the community has responded very well to that, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity. It'd be interesting to see how the game deals with that and leverages it. It's an opportunity for this sport, which is so multicultural, it actually reflects the face of Australia more than any other, clearly, to have that conversation with Australia about multiculturalism and inclusion can be challenging, it can be tough. And our game has faced it and continues to do so, and we're delighted because that's the strength of us. The game offers so much beauty. You know, if you look around this room is Australia, and this is what our competition looks like. It's not homogenous. And within here we have enmities and we have challenges, but the game gives us a space in which we can challenge those and work through them. And I hope that, you know, we're coming into a period now where the game can face up to its responsibility in that regard and have that conversation with Australia. The reason that I say that is twofold. Number one, because I play and love the game, but number two is because I actually believe that's really important for Australia, because this game has we talk about new arrival communities and refugees in a space where I spend a tremendous amount of time. The vast majority of them who come here with the ball in their heart, as we say. So I work with a refugee program the last decade out of UNSW. It's called Football United, and it's for kids who largely are coming out of war-torn areas, you know, severe emotional, psychological trauma, family trauma, and the program utilises football to provide an opportunity for these children to socialise and integrate. And of course, the students of the School of Community Health and Medicine, you know, put some data around that, some measurement, and it's incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. It's been recognised by FIFA now as one of their family of kind of CSR. It's internationally recognised and a really important program. That's what sport can do. It is critically important for young people who need a space to be able to communicate with others. And what football gives them is an opportunity to play which provides an ongoing, like a game is 90 minutes, right? So you don't put them in a room and all of a sudden say everyone has to get on. It gives you time to work through, you know, whatever the status of the child or the young person is. It might take 2, 3, 4 weeks. It might be the first training session. It might be the first moment. It doesn't matter. Over time, we're in a safe space where we're playing together on shared rules. We're training together on shared rules. And over time, at some point, we might connect. And even if we don't, I'm watching you, I'm hearing you, I'm seeing that you're human like me, I'm seeing that there's commonalities even if there's differences. The power of that for young people, we know, is just amazing.
So it's a sense of we look after our own, whether it's in an Australian sense or in a football sense. And then what happened last November, of course, was the Hakeem Al-Araibi story. Just kind of took us all by surprise and outraged us by what happened there. And in a sense, it's a similar kind of thing. We're looking after our own. You were instrumental in that story. Many people were, but you were as well. How did it come onto your radar? Why did you decide to get involved in that?
So I had been working with refugee kids for probably a decade. A big issue, street soccer, homeless program, Indigenous children's programs. We have a fabulous program across the top end. It's in about 14 communities now and is expanding through John Moriarty football. And so the reason I say that is because I believe strongly in two things. Number one, the game has a responsibility to provide opportunities to every child, particularly those in vulnerable situations. And secondly, I've been provided with all this, and I have a responsibility as someone who played for the country to give these children the opportunity I didn't have. So when I came up through the country area, it was a very simple life. I've never had to flee persecution. I've never been tortured like Hakeem had. I don't have to, in this country, explain who I am or what my colour is or why I don't speak in the appropriate lingo. I've been provided with every single opportunity you could possibly have, including government funding of a scholarship for me to go and try and play for Australia. So I believe that I have a good position. SBS has been able to provide me with, if you like, for want of a better term, a platform, which means I can speak to our community. Not all listen, but that's not the point. The point is I am in a position where they are listening. Whether they agree or not is their choice. And therefore, I can use that for the game and particularly for kids who deserve an opportunity in the game. Now, in that context, this kid got himself involved in an international incident where he'd become incarcerated and detained in Bangkok. And it became clear, I didn't know him and I wasn't really aware of the story. I probably should have been, but he had been incarcerated and tortured for 5 months a few years previous, and he'd spoken out against the president of the Asian Football Confederation very bravely, in fact, when he was in Melbourne. And in that context, you can see how it's natural to realise that I had to try and help him. In fact, if I didn't, as an ex-international or even captain of the country, I think I would have been, derogating my responsibility, quite frankly. Because if the ex-players cannot step forward for the current players, then what legacy do we have? What values do we have? There can't be any. So it came to my attention somehow. I can't quite recall how. It would have been a number of ways, but our Players Association got involved. I'm a former chairman, so it's natural that they would come to me. And when this young man in football got involved in trouble, I think in many ways I was the natural port of call.
So we have a government in place, there's diplomacy. Why was that not good enough? Why did we need to do something more?
Well, because politics, there's two things, as everyone in the room knows, but I saw very clearly in this matter was two things that severely constrain what often looks like a really straightforward matter, politics, whether domestic or international, and money. And we had two really key stakeholders. One were governments, and the second was sport, in particular football. Many different actors in both of those spheres. So we had Australian, Thai, Bahrain governments, and we had FIFA and AFC, the Asian Football Confederation. We also had the IOC Olympics, which we brought to the table. But And in each of those spheres, there was huge constraining factors in both politics and in football, particularly money. So the region, Hakeem was from Bahrain, and that entire region is a huge economic driver of particularly football at the moment in the world. Some other sports, you know, Formula One and other things have races there and so on, but in football there's immense investments from the Gulf region all around the world. And as soon as this occurred, having been a chair of, it was quite a unique case, but having been a chair of a players' association, spent 25 years kind of fighting against governing bodies, I had a fair idea of how they were or were not going to act. And it was obvious that the influence that Bahrain and other countries and allies and others and the political constraints or structure of football was never going to be capable of acting in an appropriate and particularly not urgent manner for a young kid who, you know, has no leverage, has no name, has no real media backing, and who simply doesn't have the power to be able to break through all of those huge barriers.
I'm just noting that there's some questions coming up on Slido. We'll deal with some of them as well. But was there a fear in the back of your mind that if you're kicking up a fuss in a sort of public campaign like this, that ultimately it might backfire and they're just going to, you know, double down on their action against Hakeem and he will end up in a far worse position?
No. Yeah, no, there was. But it wasn't in the back of my mind, it was in the front of my mind, is why I say that. So yes, it was a huge factor. It was a real problem. And what I did throughout the campaign, essentially, people came to me just for help, and I started to share things as we do every day, and say, look, this person needs help, and da da da. And then at some point, reasonably quickly, I realised I read his backstory. I thought, this kid is going nowhere. He's potentially going to die, which we believed, and came to, I think, know throughout the campaign was pretty much a fact. And he needs urgent and the strongest possible advocacy to break through these barriers. But within that, I hadn't done it before. There was some and growing criticism and questioning throughout, always, which I was aware of and was quite good because it kept me aware of that issue. You know, many people who have been to Thailand, every Australian has, including me, you know, consider themselves or ourselves, you know, cultural experts on Thais, and thought that if they were pushed too far, then there could be a negative reaction. The fact was, I was very careful to I set up a network through which I could get constant information out of Thailand and out of the Thai government and other stakeholders as to where they were and whether that was likely to happen. So everyone that I met, including the embassy in Bangkok and others, other embassies, I made sure I kept saying to them, you need to advise me immediately if you see X, Y or Z. And so right throughout, the tone of the campaign was very much based on the information I was being given constantly. And I had a social media team that was working behind me, which just basically was organic, it just came to being. And I was kind of, if you like, advising them, in control of them to a large degree, and we would just change tack, change tone, change narrative as we were going, and we were ready at any point just to pull entirely. And in fact, near the end of the campaign, that happened. Through advice from some government stakeholders, we knew that a potential breakthrough was imminent, and I was asked to tone down what I was saying, which I did through a period. But in other words, we put the pressure to such a huge degree that we broke through that barrier and were able to create the space for a resolution. And at that moment, we stepped back to say, we are capable of and willing to step back. We want to see a resolution here. We want to see this kid out and see him home. And it's not about the campaign, it's about getting him out. So we actually did step back.
So tell us about that public pressure that you spoke about there. I remember we had a chat at the time, and you were saying, you remember that the hashtag Save Hakeem was trending all over the world, and you were saying to me, it doesn't happen by magic. It happens by people's input and people's work. So how did it happen? How did Save Hakeem hashtag become such an important cultural factor?
Well, it demonstrated the power of ordinary people like us and the positive power of social media in the context of so much negative power that it also does have, as we all know. It can do extraordinary things, and it did do. It trended in 81 countries. I think it reached over 30 million people. There were a couple of key moments. I think, look, having 17 years in the media as well was also really valuable throughout, because the management of the messages was critical in an environment which was quite fraught. So Hakeem was a young, convicted, improperly, but to some sections of society it doesn't matter, because he's an immigrant, or he was a refugee, which in this country sometimes is worse. And so he was a refugee, convicted criminal, and he's a Muslim. And that is a pretty fraught space. So it was really important, and we were very careful to make sure that we framed his problems as human rights. So let me rephrase that. I made sure that I framed his problem as what it is and what it was. So I told the truth, that he is a young man who is in trouble and who Australia should step forward for. And that in actual fact, all the factors I talked about before are completely irrelevant. And that's why we're in the room today. That's why the campaign was so powerful, right? Is because it wasn't my issue that some people in Australia might have problems with some of those factors, because they shouldn't. That's what diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism is about. In relation to the court case, I read the court case right at the start, because I knew that I was going to have to try and draw in a whole heap of, firstly, high-profile people who I know well and who trust me and were going to put their reputation and name forward. So I read the case. I knew that the kid was innocent. But in relation to refugee and his religious beliefs and background, the beauty of the campaign was this, and why the campaign is, I think, important for Australia going forward. And I hope that we can utilise it to have a different discussion. And I might say, late in this month, there is a book coming out on the campaign for this very purpose. And Australian Story will also do a show late this month. And the point of those two things is to say to Australia, what you did was exactly what you should do. It was amazing, it was phenomenal, it was beautiful, but actually that just really should be the way that we treat all asylum seekers and all refugees. But we were inspired, and we all felt so wonderful afterwards for what we did, in part because we've come out of this fraught, contested space and this time where many of us are not proud, are embarrassed of the way that we've treated many asylum seekers. And so this was a hugely positive campaign to say for a lot of Australians, you know, we are compassionate and we can do this for a human being. And the point of what will happen later this month is then to say, that's great, that's what our country is about, and we should be capable of doing that every day for everyone.
The reality, of course, is that we are polarised. As you say, it's a fraught space in which to have a debate, not just nationally, but internationally. It's a big, big problem at the moment. Were you prepared for a backlash against what you were doing, and how did that eventuate?
Well, again, you know, being in the media for 17 years, I've seen everything. You know, you see the people lifting you up unnecessarily, because you're on television, within our football community or outside, and giving you kind of a social credit that quite often you probably don't deserve. I've seen the opposite. I've seen the trolling. I've experienced that. I saw Lucy last year in Russia when, over her pronunciations, she had this heinous trolling and so on. So I've seen the best and the worst. And so that was important because that gave me an understanding of what can happen. I think some understanding of how to try and avoid that, of how to shape the messages. And I also having had experienced it, I think you lose the fear of that anyway. So I knew that there was a lot of risk. I mean, at some point our family sat down. I sat my wife down and said, look, basically this kid is half my age. He was 25 years old, and here we are with this amazing family, amazing life, amazing experiences, right? And whatever happens now, happens. This kid has been tortured for several months. I believe if he gets extradited, he's in deep trouble. There was a similar case only 2 years earlier where the person's never been seen from again, and in fact was extradited from Thailand back. And when this young man arrived back in the host country, I believe they had a wheelchair for him because somehow between Thailand and Bahrain he'd broken several bones and all these things, right? And then he was in. The family saw him once, hadn't seen him now for several years, so he was in deep trouble. And quite frankly, I just said to Lara, my wife, look, we've had all of these wonderful opportunities. We're in this position now, and this kid and his wife deserve to have what we've had. So we have to go, and irrespective of what happens, we have to, I'm happy to take responsibility for that. We're going to have to go 100%, but I knew, knowing how football works, I was confident that I could pull the right levers and make the right noises and talk the right language to put enough pressure on them that we could actually crack the case.
We'll get back to human rights in just a moment, but I think we have a follow-up question to the work you do with traumatised kids through UNSW that you spoke about a little bit before. The question is, I feel many of our migrant parents are still in survival mode and do not understand how sport nurtures a young person's life. How do we address this?
There are smarter people than me in this conference and in this room about that. I listened to Andrew yesterday, the professor of sociology, talk about some of these issues, and it can be really challenging. So, for instance, sport has to be a safe space for everyone in Australia. That means, irrespective of gender, irrespective of sexual orientation, irrespective of background and nationality, culture, all of these things, and therefore sport has to have policies which quite often, the parents will feel uncomfortable with. But that's actually the value and the power of sport, because kids and everyone who is competing in this environment every week is learning about the social mores, the social expectations, the social responsibilities, and particularly the rights that everyone else has within this space. And sport brings them together, makes them collaborate, makes them play against other cultures and other people. And in that way, we have an opportunity for people to build greater understanding. Does it always happen? I don't know, but I tell you what, there's very few things that have been invented in the world that provide that crucible for all of these different issues to come into a space and have an opportunity to work themselves through.
Okay, behind my shoulder here, you see there's a clock flashing. I think
Yes.
we're out of time, but I just wanted to ask you just very briefly, I know we're 4 minutes over already, where you want this conversation to go. I mean, you've got this platform that you've created, not just for football, but for human rights. Where next for you?
So human rights in sport is really important because the policy that FIFA has, which is the strongest in the world, was critical to getting Hakim out. We've had a number of cases recently. The Iranian women, for instance, want to go and watch male football games in Iran. Gender equality is part of the statutes of FIFA and in my view is non-negotiable. So therefore FIFA the suspension and expulsion is open to them in relation to Iran as a member nation. That's the power of human rights in sport, is that in future I believe FIFA and IFC and others are going to be, so as part of your participation in the international sporting community, there are universal human values and human rights here which you must abide by. That is incredibly powerful. So we see that increasingly coming to life. The problem at the moment is sports, because of politics and money, are not able to implement, and one of the Iranian fans died unnecessarily, in my view, only 2 weeks ago. FIFA have had 3 to 5 years to implement this policy and they haven't done so. So therefore, that requires strong advocacy from players and former players like myself, not in FIFA but across all sport, for the implementation of policies and in particular the adherence to. That's important, and in the Australian context, I think the next few months and into next year is an opportunity to have a talk about the Hakeem campaign, to revisit how we felt and I think some of the values that we brought to life, and talk about how we're treating other asylum seekers, what we're doing in indefinite detention, and the fact that I believe Australia's ready to move on from that, and to try and have that conversation in a way that is going to bring all of Australia to the table. And as someone said yesterday, I think in one of these things, it might have been the Australian Human Rights Commission, we had a conference 3 days ago or something, and Michelle Bachelet was in town, and they're saying, look, Australia's had, because of this polarisation, and social media plays into this, there's an increasing disability to have these type of dialogue and discussions. Well, we're going to need to have that around offshore detention. So I think that's kind of the next 6 months to say to Australia, let's move on from that and find clearly humanity and the treatment of every person in Australia and around the world should be the starting point for any type of policy in any social arena. Refugees no different. So let's have that discussion.
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful that the momentum is continuing with the Australian story coming up and the book. So congratulations on that. Could I just introduce you to somebody who's, I think, a success story in refugee terms? Fablice Manirakiza grew up as a child soldier in war-torn Burundi. He escaped in 2007 and arrived in this country as a refugee. I'm just looking around to see where he is. Oh, there he is. Okay. And has established himself as a very, very successful Australian now in the world of music, arts, and of course promoting his native country of Burundi. He's been a proud ambassador for his community and has been president of the Australian Burundian community in Victoria. I'm just going to invite him up to join us. Have you got a mic there, Fablice?
I've got it.
How did you end up from having to leave Burundi and ending up in Australia? How did that work for you? How was that journey?
Thanks, Anton. Good morning, everyone. It has been a long journey and a story to tell. So I started becoming a refugee when I was 2 years old in Burundi, and we flew to Rwanda, and we had to flee back to Burundi when the genocide kicked off in Rwanda in 1994. And then when I was 8, I lost both of my parents because my mom was Hutu and my dad was Tutsi, so it was between those two ethnic groups. On the age of 11, I became a child soldier. I was kidnapped to become a child soldier, but then I was lucky enough to escape, and I found myself in a refugee camp again in Tanzania. And after that, I was me and my sister, we were finally accepted by a country we never knew anything about. Believe it, all we knew about Australia was kangaroos. So I thought we're coming to look after kangaroos. So that's how we ended up here, and it has been an overwhelming journey.
And how important has music been in that journey for you?
For me, music has become a platform because I believe music is a universal language. And music has helped me to really express really a voice of changing the world, because I'm a young person who's crazy enough to think I'm gonna change the world. And and music has helped me, because I think being a universal language, this is where I was able to use my experiences of what I've been through to really deliver it through my talent to become who I am. And using my tradition talents, such as the Burundian drumming and Burundian music, it's really showed me and embraced how Australia really is a multicultural country. I know there's a lot of to do, but I think for me, I've witnessed the power of multiculturalism. Yes.
Okay, and Fablice is going to perform one of his songs for us before we get some final thoughts from the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton. I'm going to perform a song called Light of Peace. It's a song really talks about how Australia has become my light of peace. And I guess most of us share the same story. So it's a very early morning, and if I could ask you all to stand up, because it's gonna get down. Yeah. All right, so I just want you to, I will be requesting you to wave your hand like this, throw the peace sign up there, drop the bass. Thank you very much. Yeah. All right. Can you turn the music up? I love the music up a little bit. Yeah. Light of peace. From the streets of Burundi to the streets of Melbourne. This is the light of peace. Thank you very much. It goes like this. Everybody, yeah. Light of peace. Gave me freedom. Light of peace. Gave me freedom. I used to believe I would never have the freedom. I used to believe I would never see the kingdom. Light of peace gave me freedom. Light of peace gave me freedom. I used to believe I would never see the kingdom. Yeah, check it. It goes like this. I was just 11 when I became a soldier. Bullets in my hands and a gun on my shoulder. Being a schoolboy but being made to kill. I didn't like my life but I just had to deal. Blood on my shoes and fighting all day. Ducking all the bullets, the devil had its way. Every morning my tears made my pillow get down. But I had no choice, it was war or come. I believed in myself, I hoped and I prayed. Wish to see a light, hoping for a better day. But I'm laughing big time and my life is a wonder. Cause I found freedom in a land down under. Yeah, in a land down under. Everybody, yeah. Gave me freedom, yeah, I used to believe, yeah, check it, I would never see the kingdom, light of peace, gave me freedom, light of peace, gave me freedom, I used to believe I would never see the king, I used to believe, yeah, it goes like this, light of peace, it gave me freedom, I used to believe I would never see the king, but now I make a change and I never stop praying. People had a dream that Obama would change the US. I had a big dream and became my reality. Fight to Annabella lab but end up in the ghetto. I've tried many ways, homie, even in the hustle. When the genocide came, Red Cross was a bustle. There wasn't many workers, so they were struggling. The leaders weren't strong. People find it troubling, who could ever know? I'm 5 years old, I study so bold, I thought I get told, check it, yeah, gave me freedom, I used to believe, check it, I would never see the kingdom, light of peace, gave me freedom, light of peace, gave me freedom, I used to believe, I would never see the kingdom, I used to believe, I will never see the kingdom. Freedom is all we need. Love is all we need. No time for greed. Australia, hear us. Freedom. That's all we want. We are human beings too. Thank you very much for accepting us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Fablice Manirakiza for sharing his art with us. And thanks to all of you for attending, and our special thanks also to my esteemed colleague from SBS, Craig Foster, for sharing his